Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. Mala's at my feet, and let's talk about seeds today. This is one of those topics that hits just about the same time every year, and every year there's new stuff to learn about starting our seeds. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hello to Riverdale Gardens. Glad you could be here for 2 weeks in a row. There's Mala's tail walking away. Jordan Marie Organics, always nice to have you here. Glad you could join us as well. Hello to everybody from Indiana to Tennessee to Maryland to Connecticut. It's so nice to have you here. And of course, a shout out to Jay and Heidi as we move forward with the show today. I wanted to talk about seeds, partly because I do this about the same time every year, but it's also one of those things that many of us do. I think all of us should consider, and yet there's still a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding about starting our own seeds. And when I mean starting seeds, I'm primarily focusing on starting seeds indoors to grow the seedlings and the plants that will then go outside into the garden. But of course, a lot of this information is transferable between starting early and then direct sowing outside. So, you got a question? Ask the question, and we'll definitely try to get to it today. Hello to Budget Gardening Vita Loca in New Hampshire and Porter Lockwood in Maine. I don't know if you knew this, Porter, but I lived in northern Maine for 4 winters. So I'm familiar with that. That was a long time ago. Kelly Jobots in Kentucky, John C. in the UK, Riverdale Gardens, of course, is in New York. Major S retired from Georgia, Sam Pusick from Ohio, Lion Dogs from East Tennessee. Isn't this fantastic? And of course, Mary West Carruthers in Southeast Michigan. I could go on because more and more people are signing in, and we are gardeners from all over the world, which is just what's so fantastic to this whole community that we have. And regardless of where we are, regardless of where our garden is, when we talk about seeds, the information is the same. And that's why this is such a good topic, I think, because we can all learn from it regardless of where we are. Seeds are quite magical. My most recent video, I talked a little bit about how magical seeds are to me on many different levels, but the seed itself has everything it needs to germinate. You don't need to add fertilizer to it. You don't even need to put it into potting soil. All a seed needs to actually begin growing is just some heat, some water, and some oxygen. That's it. Those 3 things will jumpstart the little energy, that embryo inside the seed to get it growing. You don't even need to have anything to grow it in. That's why a germination test is usually done on a wet paper towel. You don't have to put seeds in soil to get them to grow. You just need to provide the oxygen, the heat, and the water. Now, that's to get it germinating. Beyond that, we can take it to many, many different levels, and I'll be talking about those different levels as we proceed today. But let's break that down. Each of those 3 primary components that all seeds need to begin growing. First off is the moisture. One of the reasons we can save seeds for years and years is because if you save them in a dry environment, they can't germinate. They need that moisture to begin germination. And if you try to store your seeds in a wet environment, or if the seeds are wet when you put them into storage, you run the risk of mold developing, of the seeds rotting. They really do need to be dry. But a dry seed is not a dead seed. A dry seed is a dormant seed that's just waiting to wake up. And moisture is the key component to waking up those seeds. The other aspect is heat. Now, when we store our seeds, typically it's a cool, dry environment. Cool being the the lack of a warm temperature, because as temperatures warm, the seeds are more likely to germinate. So when you throw a moist environment and a warm environment together, the seeds are more likely to begin germinating. And then the air is just to keep the seed alive. That's kind of a given. Just the air around us is going to provide all the oxygen that a seed needs to germinate. So you're probably not starting your seeds inside an oxygen tent, and you're also not starting your seeds in a vacuum that's deprived of all oxygen. So that's a non-starter. It's there. You don't even have to worry about it. But it's the warmth and it is the moisture that we have the most control over. And different seeds need different warm levels. The temperatures that seeds germinate at run the gamut. So if you look at some of the charts you can find online, and I talk about some of this in some of my videos, some of the cool season plants, brassicas in particular, can germinate when the temperatures are very, very cold. You can germinate cabbage seeds, you can germinate spinach seeds, you can germinate a lot of those kind of seeds if the temperature is just above freezing. But the amount of time it takes for that seed to actually begin growing can be very lengthy. So some of those seeds, while they can germinate if the temperature is, let's say, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 2 degrees Celsius, it might take a month or 2 months for that seed to germinate, but it will germinate. If you talk about a pepper seed or a chili seed, it's going to require much warmer temperatures to germinate. You can spend years at a cold temperature like that, and it will never germinate. They require temperatures more in the 60-degree range, about 16 degrees Celsius, before they can begin germinating. And warmer is better. And that's the case for most seeds. Warmer temperatures would lead to faster germination. So, our household temperatures generally are warm enough for most of the seeds that we want to grow. But especially during the winter time here in Colorado, in winter, I keep my house at about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 20 degrees Celsius. And that is suitable for most of the seeds I want to germinate. That includes tomato seeds and eggplant seeds and those chili pepper seeds. They will germinate without any extra moisture over time. So without anything other than my standard household air, I can expect a pepper seed to germinate in about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. But if I put it on top of a heat mat, a mat that's actually generating higher temperatures, I can get that pepper seed to germinate within 4 or 5 days. That's the effectiveness of heat. And so we'll talk more about that as we continue. And let's start getting to some of these questions. MKN says, is there a shortcut to cold stratification? No, there really isn't. So I was asked this question recently in one of my videos where I was talking about stratification. And it really is a time component. So for those of you that don't know about cold stratification, there are quite a few seeds. Most of them are native plants and perennials. It's the kind of seed that in nature would be spending its first year outside during the winter. So think about those perennial flowers that you might grow, and they set seed, and that seed drops, and that seed stays in place all winter long. And then some of those seeds will start sprouting in spring. Well, when we buy those kind of seeds and want to grow our own perennials and our own native plants, native grasses, all of those kind of seeds that are perennial and have to survive through the winter, most of them require cold stratification. And that means exposing those seeds to cold conditions. And there is a definite time to stratification. And so most of the good seed companies will label their seed packets with what the stratification needs are, or at the website, they'll tell you about the individual seeds. And so a seed where the packet says stratify for 30 days or stick in your refrigerator for 30 days, that's usually the way we cold stratify. It's going to take 30 days. Some seeds require 60 days. Some seeds require much more than that. There are some seeds that are extremely difficult to germinate because you have to expose them to a period, often 60 or 90 days of cold temperatures. And then you have to put them into a warm environment for another 3 months. Then you need to put them into a cold environment again for 3 months. And so some of those seeds are what we're doing is mimicking nature. Some of those seeds can take 2 years to germinate in nature. They need to be exposed to a winter, then they need to be exposed to a summer, then they need to be exposed to winter again. So cold stratification is one of those things that can take time. And if you lower the temperature, it's not going to accelerate the process. You need the time that that clock inside the seed is logging for it to germinate most effectively. So good question, but it's one of those things that, as with much about gardening, patience is a virtue. There isn't really a good way to hasten some of the things we want to do. Now, when we talk about the seed starting, yes, we can hasten the germination of most seeds by having a warmer environment, like putting those seeds on a heat mat. That can hasten germination, but it doesn't work the opposite when we're talking about the cold that some of these seeds need. So shout out to Tony O'Neill, Simplified Gardening. And so I did want to mention it. So since you're here, Tony, I'll go ahead and mention it now. When Tony was on the show a few weeks ago, we talked about his book, and his book is almost out. Many of you have done the pre-ordering of the book, but we're getting down to the last couple days before Tony's book is actually going to be available to all of us. So I'll definitely be putting that out on my social media. And I'm glad you're here today, Tony, because I did want to make sure everyone knows that your book is just about to be released. We talked about it before it was actually public, and now it's almost time. So I think that's exciting. It always is nice to do it. And you're very welcome, mate. Tony says that he appreciates it, of course. So if you haven't looked at it yet, you can go to the live stream we had a couple weeks ago. And then, of course, I'll put a link in all my social medias when the book is actually available. Serena's wondering, do any seeds benefit from being freezer stratified? So not really. When we talk about the cold stratification temperatures, the clock basically begins at about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, about 4.5 degrees Celsius. And it's when the temperatures start dropping below that down to freezing. That's the temperatures that those seeds need. And that's why the refrigerator, most of our refrigerators are below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's in that range just above freezing. That's the temperature that's really most effective for stratification. And I hasten to recommend using the freezer for most gardeners. This is one of those things that most freezers nowadays have a cycle where it tries to get rid of all of the frost on the inside. For those of us of a certain age, we can remember when we had the freezers and they would just get coated with the frost and the ice on the inside of the freezer. Well, so now to prevent that, newer freezers have a cycle that you might not even be aware of, where the temperature inside the freezer will actually warm up and then cool down and warm up and cool down, so that you don't get that development of the frost and ice inside the freezer. That could damage seeds. If the seeds aren't completely dry, if there's still moisture in that seed, then when it goes into the freezer, that causes the moisture in the seed to expand. And then when you go through that freezer cycle where it warms and thaws and warms and thaws, that can actually cause damage to the seed. So unless you've got a freezer that does maintain a consistent cold temperature below freezing, I don't recommend using freezers to save seeds, to store seeds, or to use for stratification. A regular refrigerator is all you need, and that will accomplish everything that you want to do in that respect. Big Will Dog, hello to you. I tend to grow intensely due to low space. I sift my leaf mold in 1 year compost down to 1/16 of an inch, depending on crop and function. Do you texture soils for intended plant seed? I think that's a great idea. So yes, I don't. I mentioned a little bit about screening compost in some of my seed starting videos, not all of them. Uh, the key is not so much the seed, though that does play a big role, but it's the seedling that emerges that really influences what kind of soil I use. So a big reason why I use a seed starter mix, which is essentially just perlite and peat moss, is because it's light, and once the seed germinates, the roots can grow into it, and then the seedling can emerge from it because it's such a light material. If you're trying to start your seeds in a potting mix or a potting soil that you buy at the store and it comes in a bag, those mixes often have chunky pieces in them. And if you're starting a very small seed, then that initial seedling is going to be very small as well. And if you're trying to start it in a chunky mix and there's a little piece of wood on top of that seed, when the seedling emerges, it's going to hit that wood and it's not going to be strong enough to push the wood out of the way and grow past it. And so sifting your mixes, especially if it's a mix that has those chunky pieces in it, is a great idea because that's less likely to interfere with the seedling growth. And it's also less likely to interfere with the root growth. Now, the roots will find a way around things that are in the soil, but it takes a lot of energy, it takes extra effort, it takes away from the growth of the seedling. You really want a mix that is loose and free for all of the new growth that seed is putting out. So I love that idea. I do that, directly answering your question, when I'm using a chunky mix, and if I'm using a compost that also has chunks in it as well, I'll screen it. I don't usually go down to a 16th of an inch. I'll typically go down to a quarter of an inch just because that's the size of the screen I have. But that can be very effective in having seed success and making sure that the seeds are going to grow the way you want to do it. So great question. SJK is wondering, if I leave my seed collection in a barn that gets very hot in the summer, will that ruin them? Seeds are kept in dark, dry containers. So yes, it actually can. So last month, I did a video about seed vigor, and that is one of the issues that we will have with our seeds and how long they last. If you store them in the barn and the temperature is fluctuating, especially if you get hot temperatures in summer and cold temperatures in winter, that's going to affect the vigor of the seed. Now, the seeds will probably germinate with no problem, but after that germination, how well the plant grows, that is affected by the conditions that the seeds are stored under. So I would say move them into an indoor closet if you can, an indoor closet or your basement or someplace out of the way, where, because we're storing seeds for months of the year, and it really doesn't matter where they are. We're not paying attention to them. So put them in a cool, dry inside location where they have more consistent temperatures, and the seeds will last longer. And the vigor of the plant, once the seed germinates, will actually be better. So I've known gardeners. I haven't done this because luckily I learned before I had it. But in greenhouses, a lot of gardeners will store their seeds in greenhouses. And before I started growing in greenhouses, I would talked to gardeners who would say, yeah, my seeds just, they never last more than a year or two. This is the third year I've been saving the seed and none of them germinated. And they're storing inside a greenhouse that gets incredibly hot during the summer. And that's what the seed vigor is all about. Excessive temperatures can really, really have an impact on how well the seeds are going to do, not only in germination, but primarily for the actual growing of the plant as well. So Stephanie's wondering, how long do asparagus seedlings need to stay under grow lights after they have germinated? The ferns are about 12 inches tall, planted 3 weeks ago. So the asparagus is one of those plants that we have a little bit of flexibility for. The reason for using lights and for starting our seeds indoors is to get the plants growing until we can put them outside. Now, for peppers and tomatoes and eggplants and those kind of warm season plants that we're starting early, we are waiting to get a nice, good, strong, stocky, sturdy plant to put out into the garden. And the soil needs to be warm and the temperature needs to be warm before we do that. A plant like asparagus, and this also holds true with spinach and cabbage and broccoli, those plants can handle cooler conditions. In fact, most of their growth is going to happen during the cool months and not during those warm summer months. And so, as soon as your soil can be worked, you should be able to get outside and get those asparagus spears in the ground. If the roots haven't developed much, then you might want to keep them in under lights. And so one of the things you can do is actually, if you're growing in little pots or in a tray, go ahead and dig out one of those asparagus plants and take a look at the roots. And this holds true for any time you're thinking about putting a plant out into the garden. Take a look at the roots. If there's good root development, if the roots are sturdy, if there's a lot of them, then that plant stands a better chance of survival outside. If the roots are spindly, if there's just a couple of them, then you probably want to keep them indoors until the roots can continue developing. Now, a 12-inch tall asparagus, I would suggest you try to get it out as soon as possible, because the bigger and the taller the plant, the more stress it's going to encounter when you actually do transplant it. So getting it out when it's still relatively small, but with good root development, should give you better hopes for survival. When you're putting a plant out in late winter or early spring when conditions are still cool, you usually don't need as much hardening off. Hardening off, when we take our plants and get them ready to put out into a hot environment, it can take a week or two to harden off the plants, because we're exposing these plants that were indoors in a nice, stable environment. And now we're exposing them to sun and wind and cold nights. And we do that gradually through the hardening off process. For the plants that are going out, like the brassicas and the asparagus, because it's not as hot, because the sun isn't as harsh, you should still consider a brief period of hardening off, but it doesn't need to be as long a period as we might need in the springtime for those summer plants that are going to be exposed to much harsher conditions. So Gardening with Caitlin is passing on what Matthew asked. Can you explain how to manage leggy seedlings and how to fix them? Okay. Yeah, this is one of those things that often is more trouble than it's worth. So a leggy seedling is one where the stem has grown long and thin, and most importantly, weak. And we want to try to avoid that. The most common reason that our plants get leggy is because they don't have enough light. And so that's one of those tips that I wanted to tell you about today. Have light, have a lot of light, and have the light close to the plants. And too much light is really hard to offer. Most plants can't get too much light. Now, if the light you're using produces heat, then yes, the plant can be damaged if it gets too hot, if the lights are baking the plant. But the lights, especially nowadays, almost all the lights you find in the stores are LED lights. They put off very little heat. Most of my grow lights are fluorescent lights. They put off very little heat. And if you look at my videos, you'll see that I put my lights just a few inches above the plant. So as the seedlings emerge after germination, my light might be 3 inches above those plants. And as the plants grow, I raise the lights. That is how you prevent a leggy situation. If you put your light 12 inches or 24 inches above the seedlings, when they emerge, they're not getting enough light. So they're searching for more light and they grow quickly toward the light source. That makes them leggy. Instead of saying, oh, I'm happy, I got all the light I need, I'll take my time growing, I'll develop a nice sturdy stem, and I'll take my time. That's normal, and that's what you should be trying to achieve. Instead, they're saying, oh man, I'm starving, I'm not getting enough light. Oh, there's light way up there. I'm going to stretch and try to get more so that I can survive. And once a plant does that, once it gets leggy and has that weak stem, it's very difficult to recover from that. So it's best to avoid it in the first place. Some plants, like tomatoes, if they get leggy, when you transplant them, you can bury the stem. That buried stem will send out roots, and then the new stem that grows above the soil surface, when it's exposed to the full sunlight and has that increased root growth, will develop into a normal plant. But even then, I've noticed that leggy tomatoes just tend to be a little stunted and don't do as well as a tomato that was sturdy and strong from the beginning. So the fixing of a leggy seedling, as soon as you see it look leggy, and I mean when it's 2 inches tall, maybe 3, at that point, you can fix it. Put the lights closer to the plant, and now the plant will start developing a sturdier stem. But if you've got a leggy seedling that's already a foot tall, there really isn't a lot you can do at that point. You can lower the lights, but it's still going to be weak, and it may be stunted from that point forward. And so it's best to prevent it in the first place. And Will It Grow says, put your plants 1 inch from the lights. Yeah. And it depends on your lights. And I put mine about 2 to 3 inches because they do generate a little bit of heat. But if you've got LED lights, that's the answer. Those plants need more light. So get the plants close to that light and you're more likely to have the success. So Grow Big TV. Thank you guys for becoming a new member of the Gardener Scott channel. I appreciate that. And always nice to have you here. I'm guessing it's Joe today. It's always hard to tell whether it's Joe or Corky because they'll use the same Grow Big TV. Jay Dixon, thank you so much for that. There's that link to the seed viability and seed vigor video. Alora says, to be honest, I really haven't sifted my potting soil. I just make sure not to have big pieces on top, and I have great results. So yeah, there you go. And and I'll do that. I try to make gardening as easy as possible. And it's one of those things that I'll sift my my potting mix if it's a lot of big chunky pieces. But for the most part, I've dealt with the big pieces. And so when I'm starting the seeds, if I notice a chunky piece of wood where the seed is, I just remove that piece and let the other pieces remain that might be underneath it. So that's one of those extra steps. It depends on how bad it is. So I sometimes sift, I sometimes don't. It really does depend on what the quality is of the material you're using. And so you could definitely do the same. Tony, thank you so much for gifting 5 Gardener's God memberships. You're awesome, mate. Absolutely awesome. And I'm so looking forward to having your book out. I'm one of the lucky few that actually got an advanced copy of the book, and it really is good. So, yeah, so those of you that have pre-ordered, and that those of you who will order, you're definitely going to enjoy it. TJ the Hawk is wondering, how long do you think it takes to harden off plants going in the greenhouse in March? Great question. And so this is actually part of my plan with my greenhouse. I've mentioned that in the past, that my primary purpose for having a greenhouse during spring is to harden off the plants. Now you need to think about why you're hardening off the plants and what your plants are being exposed to. And so the harshness of the sun is a big part of that. The summer sun just is hot, it's long, and it can damage young plants. So when we're hardening off in May and June, we have to take it slower. We have to gradually increase the amount of sun exposure, that intensity, to just a few hours a day. But if we're hardening off in March, the sun isn't as intense. And so you can actually harden off your plants in a greenhouse in early spring and get those plants exposed to the warmer conditions and the sun exposure in less amount of time, because it's not as intense. Even when hardening off in the greenhouse, I still recommend moving the plants outdoors for at least a couple days before transplanting, so that they're exposed a little more gradually to wind and to the nighttime temperatures. So there's still that aspect of hardening off that you won't get inside a greenhouse. But as far as the intensity of the sun, I'd say you could cut it in half. Now, I haven't actually done a measurement of how many days, because I'll look at the individual plants and see how they're doing. But if your normal hardening off period is 2 weeks, do it for a week in a greenhouse. If you normally harden off for 8 days, probably after about 4 days in the greenhouse, the hardening off process should work fine. And I'll actually be doing more experimentation on that this year. Now that I've got water in my greenhouse, I'll be doing more hardening off inside the greenhouse to see if I figure out that there's a more precise answer. I haven't done that yet, but generally, based on when I was at the school and had the big greenhouse, the 42-foot greenhouse, it was about half the time in the greenhouse than outside the greenhouse, and that worked out pretty well. So give it a shot. See what you find out as you're working on it. Bud saying, this time of year I add or replace new beds. Great idea. Tip for folks is to look for a source of locally cut lumber. I build 2x10 beds 50% cheaper than the big box material. Great advice if you can find it. Well, I used to have a lumber yard here that would do that, and it was a great option, but they closed down a number of years ago, and many of us just have that big box option. But I completely agree with you, Bud. If you can find a local source for almost everything that you would be using in the garden, I highly encourage you go local. You may save money, you might spend more, but supporting the local economy and developing that relationship with that supplier for your garden, I think, is very, very important. I in the past have had some of those kind of relationships, and you might pay more, like with a nursery. They might give you a bargain if they know that you're a regular customer. But at the end of the season, when they're cleaning up and clearing out, if you've got that relationship established with a lumber yard, with a nursery, whatever it happens to be, that's when you can get some really good bargains, because they often save their best stuff for their best customers. So consider that as a long-term investment in your garden. Establishing some of those relationships can really pay dividends over the years as you take advantage of some of that. So I'm just wondering, what's the lowest temperature sweet pea seedlings can tolerate in an unheated greenhouse overnight? So I don't know an exact answer to that. The sweet peas are grown a lot in the UK. Sweet peas, really, believe it or not, are not grown a lot in the United States, which is a bit surprising to me. I'll be growing more of those. They can handle some extremes in temperature. For most seedlings, that we want to grow, I encourage that you keep the temperature as warm as possible. Now, when we're germinating inside a house and it cools down at night, my furnace drops at night. It's still warm. Few of us are having a cold house at night, and I mean cold, as cold as an unheated greenhouse might get. And so trying to keep our seedlings in a general range of, let's say, 60 degrees to 70 degrees. So about 16 Celsius to uh, about, call it 20 Celsius, 21 Celsius. That's a good range for all plants that we're going to be growing. Some can handle cooler conditions than that, but I really don't recommending letting your seedlings drop below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. They really need warmer conditions to get established. Will those plants grow below 50 Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius? Sure, it's not going to kill them, but they're not going to grow as well as a warmer condition. So that's the threshold I use. And I've been monitoring my night temperatures in my greenhouse, and I'm still not there yet. My nighttime temperatures are dropping down to about 45 Fahrenheit or about 8 Celsius. And that's just colder than I want my seedlings to be exposed to. When we talk about the seeds and the temperature will affect germination, well, the growth of the plant is also affected by temperature as well. And so you want the early growth of your plants to be as strong as possible, and a warm environment will definitely benefit the plants and try to keep them growing strong rather than running into that issue where they might not be as strong and they might be stunted and the future growth may not be as good as you would like it to be. Gardening with Caitlin, thank you for that super sticker. I appreciate it. I appreciate the support. And of course, appreciate that you're here. Always nice to have the regulars coming back. So let me go ahead and try to catch up with the comments and the questions scrolling down as we get to it. Lily's wondering, is there a method to get leek seed to germinate? Mine are taking forever. So leeks, shallots, there are a lot of those kinds of plants that they just take a long time to germinate. They can benefit from a warmer soil temperature. So maybe consider putting them on a seed mat. They don't like hot temperatures because they do prefer growing in cooler conditions. But patience is one of those things. I grew leeks 2 years ago, I think it was, and I just about gave up. It's like they're just taking forever. And then suddenly they all started popping up. So I'm not sure what it is about those seeds in particular. There are just some seeds that take longer, and the patience of starting your seeds needs to play a role. Consider warming the room, warming the soil a little bit. That might hasten it a bit, but it is one of those things that you just kind of have to accept. And it's so funny because there are other seeds like the lettuce seeds that just seem to germinate overnight sometimes, especially in warm soil. But then there are others that just take forever, and that's kind of what you have to accept. So, hey, Bud, I'm getting a notice that you're a member now for 25 months. That's fantastic. Thanks for your steady flow, great videos, and live sessions. You are very welcome, Bud, and I'm so glad that you've been part of the community for so long. That's just absolutely fantastic. And so Serena's wondering about what ratio of peat moss, vermiculite, and compost to use for carrots. Do you leave out the compost and just use sand? So I never use sand in any of my mixes, but I have a whole bunch of videos, and no doubt Jay will link to them. I have a whole bunch of videos on the mixes I use for seed starting and for potting soil. And so check out those videos. And I really don't differentiate between whether it's a watermelon or a carrot. Now, I'm not starting carrots ahead of time. I don't recommend starting root plants like carrots or parsnips ahead of time because they don't transplant well at all. They have the big uh, tap root. And if you damage that tap root during transplanting, you're not going to get that root that you're going to want to harvest. So when it comes to the carrots in particular and those long rooted plants, I direct sow those into my beds. So, and I'm not using peat moss and vermiculite in my beds. So I'm only using the mix for seed starting. And I do it the same, whether it's a watermelon or a pepper or an eggplant or lettuce, I'm using the same seed starter or potting soil blend across the board. So take a look at those videos and you'll see my basic mixes and what I may or may not add to them depending on how long the plant is going to be in the pot. And so I mentioned earlier, my basic seed starter mix is perlite and the peat moss. The thing about the seeds, and remember I started the show with this, if you're just catching up, you can always go back and watch it later. But seeds have all the nutrients they need to begin germination and begin growing. They don't have all the energy for a plant to grow. They just have the energy for that initial growth of the seedling. And so if you use a seed starter mix, and I do because we were talking about the texture and making sure that the roots can grow well and that seedling can grow well, you either need to add nutrients to that seed starter mix because peat moss and perlite, there's no nutrients there. Nothing that the plants can use to actually start growing. So if you start with that and want to continue with that, you will need to add nutrients. You'll need to add a fertilizer to that mix to keep the plant growing. If you use a seed starter mix like that, expect that you're required at some point to transplant that into a potting mix that has the nutrients. And so that's why my recipes for the potting mixes include compost, which has nutrients. It includes usually an organic fertilizer like the IV organic that I use because that supplies nutrients. And with those nutrients, now the seedling can start growing. Common problem, and it can cause legginess, is a lack of nutrients. So if you keep your plants in your seed starter mix too long, the plant is going to suffer. It just doesn't have the nutrition it needs, and it's going to try to make that big rush of growth to try to find nutrients someplace else, and it's going to suffer. So the seed starter mix is a temporary home for that seedling. The seed germinates, the plant begins growing. Those first two leaves that appear, the cotyledon leaves, are the ones that start soaking up the light. Photosynthesis then creates the energy for the rest of the plant to develop. And then when the true leaves, the first set of leaves after those first two, that's when it's a plant. That's when the plant now needs to find its own nutrients, its own light, its own water. And what you do at that stage of growth can really affect how well your plants are going to do. And it's usually at that point that I'm transplanting. And so I start in a flat of 72 cells because it's easy and I can put a whole bunch of seeds in the tray and they can germinate and then they're exposed to light and then they start growing. Sometimes you don't get full germination and you only have to transplant those plants that are actively growing. So it can be a more effective use of your space in your grow room. But you have to do it. You have to transplant. When you get to the second true set of leaves, I don't like to go past that. So you've got a few days between the first true leaves and then the second set of true leaves. During that time period is when you want to move from the nutrient poor environment to the nutrient rich environment. Put them back under lights. Again, keep the lights very close to those seedlings. And then as the plants grow, the lights will raise. And I typically am not fertilizing my seedlings at any point when I'm starting the seeds indoors. That potting mix has enough nutrients for those young plants to grow until they go out into the garden. And then the soil in my garden has plenty of nutrients for those plants that are now transplanted outside. So I often am asked about what fertilizers I add to my seedlings. None, other than what's in the potting mix, because the potting mix is enough. If you were growing in that nutrient poor environment, peat moss and perlite, then yes, you would need to add fertilizer when those true leaves start to develop. And then periodically you would want to add fertilizer past that point until they're big enough to grow outside. The other option is just to go ahead and start your seeds in the potting mix so that as those roots grow, they're already being exposed to the nutrients from the very beginning. Completely up to you. It's a preference issue. Like I said earlier, many potting mixes are chunkier, and so they might not allow easy root growth, but you don't need the root growth once the plants are established. And that's why the potting mix can give you so much for a happy and successful plant. So Dan is wondering, I started carrots a little late last year. They are still in the ground, very small. We have had a mild winter. If these survive, should I let them grow or should I start new ones? So I always think you should let plants grow. And so a number of reasons for that. Carrots can take, that's another one of those plants that can take a very long time to germinate. But once they germinate, and once they start growing, they can handle cool conditions and they usually do pretty well. They often start off very small. And so if they're outdoors, the sunlight is still not a lot and the temperature still may be a little cool. And so cool conditions and low light is going to affect how quickly the plants grow, and they are going to grow slower. So that could explain why they are very small. If you, or what I would recommend is that you also start new seeds and then compare the two. That's why I like to let plants grow and then also start new seeds so that I can do a side-by-side comparison. And you might be surprised that the plants that are there now will suddenly start growing. The new seeds will eventually catch up, and then compare the roots. And chances are those plants that are in the ground right now are probably going to have a smaller root than the new seeds, but they're still going to have a root. But do it for yourself and compare it. I think that can be a great exercise. I saw that with my tomato plants. I mentioned it in a video that was later in the year last year. The tomato plants that I put into the ground early, I knew they were early, but that's when Eli and I were making those tomato videos. And I could see it. The plants were smaller. They were growing slower. They just seemed stunted. They were stunted. 3 weeks later, when I put the rest of my tomato plants in, that second phase of plants caught up very, very quickly and ended up doing better overall. Those first plants still produced fruit, still a great harvest, but they just didn't grow as tall as they normally would. And they didn't produce quite as much fruit as they normally would. They still worked great, but not quite as good because it was cooler conditions, less sun, and the other plants had everything they needed when they were started. So that's why it's nice to see that side-by-side comparison to see if you discover the same results in a garden with the temperatures in particular. Shandy's Garden's wondering, what works best for you for carrots? I've tried broadcasting lightly and cardboard, covering seed tape, using board, seed paste, lights inside. I just get very few no matter what. So the best success I had with with carrots was in a greenhouse. So it was warmer when they were germinating and more protected from my harsh Colorado weather. And it was when I was at the school garden. And I let students broadcast the seeds. And so when you broadcast seeds, you basically are sprinkling them around, trying to get relatively even coverage, but that doesn't always happen. And because, like you, I've had so many issues with carrots in the past where I didn't get a lot of germination. I would let one class broadcast the seeds, and it was a pretty long, big bed. And then another class would come in and I'd let them broadcast seeds. That year, I must have had 95% germination rate. We had thousands of carrots growing in those beds. We actually spent days thinning out the carrots because so many of them germinated. So, broadcast of the seeds does work if the conditions are right. One of the biggest issues when you're starting the carrot seeds outside, and this holds true for any seed that you're direct sowing, is you've got to keep it moist. That's what the seeds need to germinate. And the sun outside dries that top level of soil so quickly that the seeds aren't getting consistent moisture. And those little seeds, like carrot seeds, are either on the surface or very close to the top of the soil, and they're more likely to dry out. So when you start those small seeds like that outdoors, you need to water 3, 4, 5 times a day, depending on how dry it is, to make sure that the soil is staying evenly moist, but more importantly, the top of the soil is staying moist so that those seeds can germinate. So that is a big factor. Now, I like seed tape or seed tape. I did a video on seed tape long ago. I made seed tape with my granddaughters. I think that video is probably 6 years old now. And one of the advantages to using seed tape is that the tape itself, almost regardless of what material it is, will hold on to moisture. So when you put the seed tape down and then you water the garden bed, that seed tape will help the seed remain moist because the seed tape stays moist. You need to water as often as possible to keep that seed tape from drying out. So that's what I have found works best for me is the seed tape and broadcasting a lot of seeds, and it usually works out well. I've tried doing individual seeds spaced 2 inches apart, and I just never get enough germination. So carrots are one of those that I do overseed. I do broadcast a lot of them, and then I have to go back and thin out, just because it is one of those plants that just has kind of sketchy germination rates. And so keep trying and keep doing more, and hopefully you'll have a bunch. Milltown Life is saying I grew the prettiest batch of carrots last year, but they tasted like turpentine. I think it was Ron's fault. He put horse manure on the bed. Interesting. So haven't heard that as a problem, but if you have carrots that don't taste bad, could be the manure. And that is one of those things, depending on what manures you're using, there could be chemicals in that manure that could influence the taste of your plants. Okay, let's see, trying to get caught up again. Tony's saying, a plank of timber can be used over the seed to keep soil moist until germination. Yeah, great idea. And I think that's what she was asking about, the cardboard as well. The idea of putting something on top of the bed so that the sun isn't drying out the soil is a great idea. And be it a plank of timber or cardboard or plastic, there are lots of options, and it can be very effective. The issue I have, and it's purely personal, I get so busy in the garden that some of those beds that I've put the piece of plywood down or I put the cardboard down, I am out in the garden and I'm thinking, oh, those seeds are probably going to germinate tomorrow. So tomorrow I'll come out and I'll remove that, and the seedling should start emerging. And then what inevitably happens is I either forget on the next day, and so it becomes 2 days, or tomorrow should have been today. And so when I remove that cover, I already have plants growing underneath it. And because they didn't have any light, now they're white and they're struggling. And in my Colorado sun, they just get baked within minutes. So that's my problem. Just be aware of it, could be a potential problem. When you put something on top of it, you need to check it regularly. And Tony is probably much better at that than I am, as far as doing a daily check and even a couple times a day to check underneath that plank to make sure that the plants aren't growing into it. And as soon as that first one emerges, take off the plank and let all those other plants grow without the obstruction. So you don't run into the problem I do where you've lost hundreds of plants fried in the sun because you were late removing the cover. So when I say I kill a lot of plants, I've killed a lot of plants by making mistakes like that over the years. Live and learn. Jay Dixon, thank you so much. There's that seed tape video link. And that was a fun one. I just came across that picture recently. It might have been 7 years ago now. No, not that long. I think 6 years ago is when I made that video, but it was fun with my granddaughters making the seed tape. And seed tape is extremely easy to use. I hadn't actually put it on my list, but it fits with the topic of the day. There are a number of different options that you can use to make seed tape. I typically will use paper towels or toilet tissue. And the idea is that you just lay out a long strip and put the seeds in. I think in that video I did newspaper. Newspaper can work very well. Just put a little paste. And the paste is nothing more than water and flour. And you put a little dab of that paste, and then you put the seed into it on whatever your growing medium is, be it paper towel or toilet tissue or newspaper, and you've made seed tape. And one of the nice things about that is the spacing of the seeds now is under your control. If we are broadcasting seeds, like we were talking about with carrots, you never know where that seed's going to land. You get uneven spacing of those plants. But with seed tape, you can get exact spacing of the plants because you determine where that dab of glue goes, that paste, and you determine where the seed goes on top of that paste. It isn't so much moisture so fast that it's going to cause the seed to germinate. And so being exposed to that wet paste for a brief period of time is okay. And the paste is going to dry. Don't use a lot of it, just a dab. The paste will dry quickly enough that it's not going to affect the seed and force it into immediate germination. So you can make seed tape well in advance and then put it out in your garden, cover it lightly with soil, keep the soil moist, and that tape material will improve the germination rates, particularly of those seeds, those little seeds like the carrot that really need the consistent moisture levels. And so Bryce is asking, my seeds just started popping through and I started the lights. When do I need to start fertilizer? So I just mentioned just a couple minutes ago, if you're just joining us, go back 10 minutes or watch again in replay, because I don't fertilize my seedlings. I use a seed starter mix and move into the potting soil mix, and that's where the nutrients are. That's where the fertilizer is. So watch that again, Bryce, because I spent quite a few minutes talking about how I do that and what my approach is to fertilizer, and that's already been answered. So Sherry is now saying, can we sing a brief requiem for my San Marzano cuttings? They've passed over, and my only consolation is getting my vases back for flowers. Sorry to hear that, Sherry. We can have a moment of silence for your San Marzano cuttings. Oh, let's hope next time that you have better success with that. The tomato cuttings, if you haven't done that, and I have a video on that as well that I did last year or the year before, where you can actually clone your tomatoes by cutting off a stem and putting it into water, putting it into moist potting mix, and a new tomato plant will grow from that cutting. Very effective way. And San Marzanos should be able to give you a good plant. I'm sorry, whatever happened, and you were not able to get them to grow. But the moment of silence, hopefully it will pay dividends for you in the future. Tony's saying you should never need to fertilize your seedlings if you're moving them on into larger pots when required. Yeah. And I know Tony and I use very similar methods in just about everything we do. And the fertilizer, and and another issue, just real quickly, it's so easy to over fertilize young plants and seedlings that I just want to avoid the whole issue completely, which is why the potting mix has the fertilizer. So many people will kill their plants by using a fertilizer that's too harsh, too strong. And so use the mix with the fertilizer in it, and you'll have much better success. Absolutely. And so more or less is asking, can you clone a semi-determinate tomato? Yeah, you can clone any tomato. The only issue, and I've had people ask about this before, there are some plants, and probably more likely a semi-determinate tomato might have some of these issues. There are some plants that are patented, and you're not allowed to clone those plants and sell them. But you can use them in your garden, and you can make cuttings, and you can make new plants from those. The issue you have with a determinate plant or a semi-determinate plant, tomatoes in particular, is that that plant does have a predetermined growth point. The plant is going to grow, it's going to flower, it's going to set fruit, and then it's done. An indeterminate tomato will keep growing and growing and growing until it dies. And so you can clone determinate and semi-determinate tomatoes. You just want to start it early. And so take some early cuttings so that those cuttings will grow into the full plant. If you clone from a plant late in its life, so a determinate or semi-determinate tomato, it's already flowering, it's already fruiting, and now you cut off one of those branches and clone it, it'll grow, but you might not get fruit from it. And so you do want to do it early in the life cycle to try to get the best success from that. And of course, there's Jay on top of things with my video on cloning tomatoes. So thank you for that, Jay. I hit 500 videos in my library just a few weeks ago. And so, especially for those of you that are new to the channel or just joining us, I so often am asked a question, and I say, I have a video on that. Well, when you have 500 videos, chances are you cover just about everything that needs to be covered in basic gardening. And Tony O'Neill has over 500 videos. There's a lot of information out there on those of us who have been doing it for so long. And so I don't mean to shrug off a question when I say I have a video on that, except to say most of my videos go into much more depth, a lot more information. And so you'll learn a lot more from watching a full video than for the 2 or 3 or 4 minutes in the live stream that I can spend to answer a question like that. And so that's why I appreciate Jay putting those links, because I can talk briefly on these subjects, but those videos really do go into much more depth. And that's why I suggest and recommend that you look at those videos if you want more information about whatever the topic happens to be. Big Wheel Dog, my strawberry plants started indoors September are throwing off flowers like crazy. If they are in decent sized pots already, how long should I wait to stop doing so? If you mean putting outside, strawberry plants can also handle some very cold conditions. My strawberry plants are already green and starting to grow, and my nights are below freezing every single night. And so strawberries can handle some very cold conditions. Harden them off a little bit, expose them to some of those cold conditions. But go ahead and get them out as soon as you can work the soil and get them out and cover them a little bit, maybe for some extra protection since they've been indoors. The strawberry plants, and this holds true for most plants, when they're flowering and then you transplant them, the plants will do better overall if you pinch off those flowers. The flowering process takes a lot of plant energy. And so you can leave those flowers, put them outside, get little strawberries for a harvest. But the plant is not putting its energy into root development, it's putting its energy into fruit development. And when you're transplanting outdoors, initially it's beneficial to get that root development because the transplanting process is going to damage roots. And the new roots need to find the nutrient rich soil that you have. And if the plant is putting all of its energy into producing flowers and fruit, that's at the expense of new roots. And so I would say go ahead and try to get them out as early as you can. And now, while they're indoors and before you get them outside, pinch off those flowers. Try to get the root development as much as possible indoors. And then you can move them outdoors and have more roots to go ahead and get that process going. It's a lot of stunted plants if you wait too long, and also if you don't pinch it off. And I'm guilty of that. Most of us have gone to the nursery or to the garden center and we get that plant, we see a tomato and it's already got a little tomato on it. And we think, bonus, I can buy this plant, put it in my garden, and I'll have tomatoes right away. And yeah, that one fruit will probably grow and it'll change color and you'll harvest it. But the plant will probably not grow as well as the smaller plants that had no flowers and had no fruit, that when you put them into the garden, they started the root growth right away, produced a big, strong plant, and at the end of the season ended up giving you more fruit and bigger and better fruit than that first one that you really wanted to see, that early harvest. Then the plant just didn't do as well. It's hard plucking off flowers. It's hard pulling off fruit of a plant, but sometimes that really is what needs to be done to get the strongest plant for the long term. Margaret Alice is asking, have you grown pine berries? I'm told they fruit the second year, so this year I'm expecting fruit. I have grown pine berries. I haven't had much success with them. Those are the white strawberries that you may have seen. And the issue I have is that my winters have been too harsh. And the ones that I have grown, very few, if any of them, actually survived the winter and made it to the second year for me to fruit. So yes, I've tried them, but in my outdoor Colorado winter, they just haven't done well at all. So I wish you the best. I hope it does work well for you. The strawberries that I am growing are varieties that can handle my cold temperatures and dry temperatures and snow and everything else. And at least the pine berries that I've tried a couple times, once at the school and once in my own garden, just didn't do well. So that's on one of those lists that I keep of plants that I'm not going to grow again. And I will at some point probably, but because I didn't have success after a couple tries, I just moved on to other things. But it is a cool plant. It is a cool fruit if you can grow it. Grow Big TV, vermiculite can in some cases contain asbestos. Do you have any concerns about this? So yes, that is a possibility because the material is mined. It has been mined from some areas that have asbestos. I know that there are safeguards in place to try to minimize that, but it's still possible that you could be using vermiculite. So what I do, and I show it in a couple videos, about my potting mix and my seed starting. I think the ones I did last year, I showed it. I wear a dust mask. And so if I'm mixing vermiculite, and I do the same thing with perlite because it can be a very fine powder. When I'm mixing that to make my mixes, I wear a dust mask. And so I'll have the room open, I'll put the mask on, I'll mix all the ingredients, and then I leave the room for a while, like an hour or more, letting things settle. And in between, I will say I do water it. So I'll mix everything up wearing the mask. I'll add water, which helps settle everything in the mix. And then I leave the room so that anything that might be floating in the air also settles. And then after that, I no longer wear the mask. So that's what I do. It's not a big concern. It's not even the asbestos that I'm most concerned about. Is just getting all those little particles, breathing them in, that I try to minimize. So few concerns, but anytime you're working with those really dusty materials, consider wearing a dust mask to help keep the material away from you, and you'll be breathing easier in the end. So Llama is asking, that's a beautiful garden behind you. And thank you for reminding me about that. It's actually past the point I normally like talking about the garden behind me. And so the garden today comes from Masabi Gal. And this one in particular, you may remember seeing this picture before. Celeste has sent pictures of her garden in the past. So this is a winter scene, and I do appreciate it. And by all means, send me photos of your garden now that you're probably starting to get out in your garden. Send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. Be sure and give me permission to use your photo. I get photos more often than you would think, and I don't use them because I don't have that gardener saying you can use this photo in your live stream or for any purpose, whatever it happens to be. So unless you give me that permission, I'm not going to show the photo behind me. I don't want to interfere with any copyright that you might have on that photo. So it's that time of year. I'm looking for photos. Send them to me. Give me a little backstory if you would, and we'll talk about it. So anyway, this photo has all of the things I love about gardening. Lots of raised beds. You may notice over here, you've got the mailbox, and I'm sure she'll be looking for that soon. Jay will probably put the link up. But a mailbox in the garden is a great place to store tools, and I made a video about that. And I still have people wondering why I've got a mailbox in my garden. Well, check out the video and make your own mailbox tool storage. So I love seeing that. You also see all the, this is the green stock, that couple different green stalks, it looks like, that have been taken apart and laid down for the winter. So I'm sure she'll be starting to put those up again. Of course, all the fencing around the garden. You've got the greenhouse in the back, and this looks just like mine. I've got the same design for the greenhouse. And so it's so nice to see a garden laid out like this. You got all the fencing around the outside. Anytime you see forested area near a garden, you can expect problems with animals. And so you've got to have that fence around the garden, or at least fences around your beds. And so you can see all the fencing around the garden. And that's always nice to see. One of the things that may not be as obvious, you can see a post, a tall post that's actually inside the fence. It looks like this is a keyhole garden. So you've got a bed, and then you've got kind of a U-shaped section. That's a keyhole area. And so I'm not sure about what this post is used, but I'm guessing it can support shade cloth or any type of material to shade that whole area in particular. So if that's not what she uses it for, put that in your bag of tricks to put a big post in the middle of your garden, and you can use that like a tent post to hold any of those materials that you want to protect your plants with. So I'm guessing that's what it is. And I think that's a great idea. And then, of course, the sitting area. I see a little table and chairs right in the middle of the garden. So every time I see chairs in the garden, I try to point it out because I think it's a great idea. I think having a space where you can sit and just soak up the garden atmosphere is just beneficial to your health, to your mental well-being, and it's also a place to take a break when you're working in your garden. So having that sitting area is always a wonderful idea. So if you look closer, you can see lots of stuff happening. You can see the green twine for trellising and holding things. You can also see other trellises in the background. So this is a gardener's garden. You can just imagine all the activity that takes place in this garden during the growing season. And so look closer at it. You might get some ideas of some things that you might want to consider trying out. And it's one of those benefits. That's why I like to show gardens. It's always a benefit to look at someone else's garden and try to get ideas for what you can try in your garden. So share your garden with me, because even if you think your garden is just basic and there's nothing to learn from it, I guarantee you other gardeners can learn from what you're doing, because we all do it a little bit differently. Every garden's unique, every gardener's unique, and you have something to share with us and help us learn. So I encourage pictures. Look forward to seeing what you all send me. Concept Education, a new member of the Gardener Scott community. Thank you for joining. So glad to have you here. And Yankee Sister Homestead, always nice. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for that donation. Thank you, Gardener Scott, for a great live. Everyone, please have a great week. Thank you for that, and do appreciate those sentiments. And thank you to Sherry in memoriam, the 6 San Marzanos passed in service to Sherry's education on growing tomatoes. Thank you for that donation, Sherry. I appreciate that. But that is so awesome that you say that, because that's exactly what I think gardening is all about. Just because you've killed a plant did not mean, or 6 plants in this case, does not mean that you failed at gardening. No, it's an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to do it better next time. And so often, too often, I've talked with people who said, yeah, I used to garden and then I killed everything, so I don't do it anymore. Oh, what a missed opportunity for life to stop gardening just because you killed plants. I've killed thousands and thousands of plants in my many years of gardening. And I learn every time a plant dies, it's given its life to move me forward on my educational journey. So 6 plants, that's hard. Yes, it is tough. And it is challenging to move forward from that. But yeah, learn from it. And it makes everything else easier in the long run. Maybe not easier next time. Might take a little while, but it does make it easier in the long run. And that's what's so important to it all. Kevin H says, I've killed so many plants, I'm not even sure whose side I'm on. Absolutely. That's a great way to say it. There are some years where it's like, I'm the Grim Reaper. All those other plants are shivering in their roots because they see me coming and they know that I killed the plant right next to it. So they're hoping I'm not going to take them out too. It happens. It just absolutely happens. And I agree with Tennessee Nana that dead plants make good compost. Even those dead plants have a purpose in the garden, not just improving our experience and education, but yeah, they've given their lives to release nutrients into compost and then into the soil so that other plants can grow better. Absolutely. So it's tough, but that's what makes gardeners tough and resilient and patient, because we know that things are going to have to improve or it's going to be bad the next time around. Renegade Ren is saying, I wish I could do more direct seeding, but without big boxes to protect them, my dogs running around would kill them all. Yeah, the animals in our garden, and you can see this in the last couple of months. The background picture has been my garden. Even during the winter, I keep hoops in my gardens because Mala will lay down in the garden. She'll run through the garden. She'll dig into the beds if I don't have protection. So I have to have my beds protected all the time because I've got a young dog with a lot of energy. And I, in the past, have had to fence my garden. I had a chocolate lab many years ago, and it was about 20 years ago now. Tried gardening for a couple years, and same issue with the dog that I just love dearly. I had to put a fence around the garden to keep her out because too many plants were dying. And that's one of those trade-offs. You want to have your animals with you, you want to have the animals outside, but you also want to grow those plants. And that barrier becomes very important, be it a fence or a box or a cattle panel hoop, whatever it is to keep those dogs out, you got to do it. So think about that. Cardboard boxes are a temporary fix, but think about a more permanent fix, like a low fence around the garden, just to help keep the animals from causing those problems. And then maybe you'll be able to do more direct sowing and you'll be able to get things growing a little bit sooner. Big Will Dog says, my 3-year-old husky has decided I needed the holes filled last year, dug up again. Yeah, I think we all feel the pain of that. The the biggest issue I have, so and I'm going to be fencing my garden hopefully this year, at least the little vegetable garden part of it. I have wire mesh under all of my beds because I have a gopher problem, and I don't want the gophers digging up through through the beds. And so in that concrete block bed, and I made a video about how I built that bed, and within a year or so, I'd also made videos of growing in that bed. So my cucumber, how to grow cucumber video is in that concrete block bed. Well, that was before I got Mala. And Lily, my lab at the time, didn't dig much in the garden. She was getting older, so it wasn't an issue. Well, once Mala came along, in that low bed, that concrete block bed in particular, I have gophers in the area. There are gophers burrowing underneath my garden, but they're not getting into the bed because I've got that wire at the bottom. Mala loves chasing gophers. She loves digging for the gophers. I think she can hear the gophers as they're burrowing underground. And so she just tore apart that concrete block bed digging for the gophers because the gophers were probably underneath the wire. They weren't actually in the bed. So a lot of digging for no results as far as Mala was concerned because she never found a gopher, but she kept digging and digging. I want to grow in that bed again this year. And the only way I can grow in that bed is if I keep Mala out. If I build a fence around that section and then not have to worry about the plants anymore. So it's a tough pill to swallow, and I've not done it for a couple years, kind of waiting until a new fence fits into the budget. And hopefully this year I'll be able to put a little fence around that area so that I can grow in all my beds. I love my dogs, but they can make gardening challenging. Just be aware of that. Janet says, my chocolate lab goes berserk when I pull weeds. He does shred each one when I toss them out. I guess that's helpful. Sure, yeah, the weeds are shredded. They'll break down a little bit faster on the soil. Mala will do the same thing. I'll have a bucket and I'll pull the dandelions or the lamb's ear or whatever it is that I'm weeding out and put it in the bucket. Yeah, she always steals something in the bucket and pulls it to the side. Same thing when I'm pruning. When I prune my trees, and you'll see this in some of my videos, my recent video, I was doing some pruning of my fruit trees, and I was cutting them into smaller pieces, partly to become new mulch on top of the soil, but also if I don't cut those branches into small pieces, Mala grabs them and runs around the garden with those branches. And some of those branches can be pretty big. And so it's no fun. If you don't have a big dog, you may not have encountered this, but when you're standing in the garden, pruning a tree, and then the dog that's carrying a 4-foot long branch comes running up to you and smacks you in the shin with that big branch, Yeah, you remember that. It tends to be a little painful. So I've learned to cut the branches into smaller pieces so I don't get whapped by my dog who's running around with it in her mouth. So live and learn. There's all kinds of turmoil we have in the garden, and it's all how we choose to deal with it when we decide that we want to uh, still garden with our animals. And you see it. All of my videos outside, you'll see mala. I can't think of a single video in the last 2 years that I've made outside that didn't have mala walking through it or lying down in the background. She's out there when I'm out there, and that's just, we're a duo. We do this gardening thing together. So why not? Okay, let's see if we have anything else. Uh, Looks like Sam has mold tunnels, and Wyoming Dirtbag says, with my new cold weather greenhouse, I have some Parthenocarpic zucchini, yellow squash, and cucumber seed varieties started, all in the goal to get that first harvest as early as possible. Awesome. I wish you the best. I'm still holding off a little bit because my greenhouse still isn't quite that warm to get those plants growing. For those of you that don't know, Parthenocarpic varieties are incredible. They are varieties that don't need pollination to give you fruit. So almost everything we're growing in our garden needs to be pollinated for the fruit to develop. It can be pollinated within its own flower. So a pepper and a tomato still has male and female parts within the flower, and it will pollinate itself. Or a squash that needs to be pollinated from another flower, and most cucumbers are the same way. So you'll have a pollinator that'll move from a male flower and then move into the female flower to pollinate it. That's what happens with the squash and cucumbers. But with the Parthenocarpic varieties, you don't need that. Those varieties don't need pollination to develop into fruit. So a normal cucumber and a normal squash is going to have male and female flowers and need that insect or you with a paintbrush to pollinate it, but not the Parthenocarpic varieties. So it's an awesome way to experiment with growing, especially if you're growing in a greenhouse and you have issues with the insects not being there to pollinate. Most of the Parthenocarpic varieties were bred for greenhouse growing. So I wish you the best in that. Hope that you have great success. Concept education. Nice to see you. How do you keep students from trying to uproot their plants before they are ready? So when I was working with the students at the Galileo Garden, one of the best ways that I found was to explain the end result in the beginning. And so it was, we are growing this plant with the intent of harvesting a cucumber or pulling it out of the ground for the carrot. And so trying to differentiate the different phases of growing so that in the beginning that it's a seed and it turns into a small plant, and that small plant will get bigger, and then we will be harvesting the fruit. And so I think it's important that they understand there is a goal that they're working toward. And then when they have their hands on actually working with the plant, then it's the caretaker aspect. We need to keep this plant alive. We need to protect this plant. It's your job to water the plant. And all of us need to make sure all of these plants make it to the end. So there's the basics. And so glad to see you here today. I look forward to actually talking more about this subject with you. And why don't you send me an email, or I'll send you an email. We can talk more about that. But thank you so much for that donation. I do appreciate it. And it's nice to have you here today. I look forward to chatting with you more about kids and education. So there's a teaser for the future. I think getting kids in the garden and learning about gardening is just such an important aspect, something we should definitely be thinking about as we move forward. I wanted to go ahead and mention one last thing when we're talking about starting seeds. And this actually comes at a good time of year right now, today. Most of the United States, at least, is experiencing very warm temperatures. And we're actually setting records in some states for how hot it's getting. It's so tempting to go outside. It's so tempting to put seeds in the ground and get growing. But it's a false spring. It's not true. It's not going to stay this warm forever. This is just a blip in the weather chart. And so be careful about when you put your seeds out and when you start your seeds indoors. Use your last frost date as a good basis of early, late, when, now. That's a really good point to determine. And the seed packets should tell you, or if the seed packet doesn't, do a little bit of extra research onto the seed company's website to find out when the seed goes in compared to that last frost date. So tomatoes, the seed packet will say start 6 to 8 weeks indoors before your last frost date. Some of those brassicas will say sow outdoors 2 to 3 weeks before your last frost date. That's really the target you should be aiming for, not what the temperature is today or what the forecast is for next week. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you are starting your seeds based on the weather and not based on historical meteorological data over time that gives you a better idea of when a plant will survive your weather. So think about that. It's especially here in Colorado where it's been so cold. This weekend past was the first weekend in 2 months that we did not get snow. In fact, the weather was so hot over the last week that all my snow, most of my snow is gone. And it's so nice outside. So nice to get out and start plants. But I am 2 full months away from being able to have plants survive in my garden, regardless of how hot it is today. So if you're not already aware of that, learn about your last frost date. I've got videos on that, of course, and it really is important for you to have that garden success. Starting your seeds at the right time, either indoors or outdoors, will ensure that the plants are growing and surviving in your garden. Hey, it's Monday. Next week, at the same time on Monday, I'll be back. Let's do this again. Let's meet together next Monday, talk gardening, new topic, and new information and new fun in this wonderful gardening community. So nice to have you here. Thank you all for your support. And I look forward to seeing you next week as we do it all over again. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.